All right, so I'd like to welcome you all. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Hallwit, and I'm a program officer at Mass Humanities. And it's really my pleasure to have all of you here for this workshop today on Holocaust education. We're going to ask that while others are speaking, if you can just keep yourself on mute, and then as we get into the breakout rooms, you'll be able to take yourselves on mute and speak with each other. Also, when you're asking questions after Professor Penzler speaks, there'll be time for questions as well. We do encourage you, I don't know, most of you are probably familiar with Zoom, but I do encourage you to, you can choose at the top right of your screen, speaker view or gallery view. If you want to be able to focus on the speaker, you can choose speaker view, and you'll just see that person's video. For those of you who don't know us, Mass Humanities is the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we fund public humanities projects all over the state of Massachusetts. And today's event actually comes out of a collaboration between two of our grantees. In 2019, we funded the Olga Lengel Institute's summer seminar for Holocaust educators in Amherst, Massachusetts, the one that Alex has attended, that Kara teaches. And I was able to visit that seminar for a couple of the days, and it's really an amazing seminar where students do really deep reflection and collaborative work to explore how to teach their students about the Holocaust and other genocides. And that grant also allowed me to get to know Jennifer Lemberg at Tolley and Kara Crandall, who we'll be hearing from today, who, as some of you know, is really a gifted teacher. That same year, we also funded a grant to produce a curriculum guide for the documentary film Exile and Community, The Life of Carola Domar, and to run workshops like this one to let teachers know about the film and the guide and how to use it in the classroom. And it's really been my pleasure to get to know Sue Reeder over the course of the last year and to welcome her here today. When I first watched this film, not only did I find it incredibly moving, but I was also struck at how well suited it was for young people who are being introduced to the Holocaust for the first time. And I think that's one of the real strengths of this particular film for teachers. Today's workshop is co-hosted by the Olga Lengel Institute, known as Tolley. And so I'd like to pass the baton now to Jennifer Lemberg, who is the Associate Director of Tolley and who oversees its US programs.
Great, thanks so much, and it's really amazing to be here with everyone. And there are definitely names of participants in our seminar that I recognize, although I haven't met all of you, so lovely to be with you here in this place. So some of you will know this already, but Tolley was founded through the vision and future sense of Olga Lengel, a Holocaust survivor and author of 5 Chimneys, a woman survivor's true story of Auschwitz, an unsparing memoir that she published in 1947. After making her way to the United States, Olga left a legacy that she intended to be used for Holocaust education, and the Tolley seminars in New York City take place in her former home, around what is literally Olga's table. Tolley held its first seminar for tri-state area teachers in New York City in 2006, and the seminar in New York has since expanded into a competitive 10-day program which brings together educators from across the US and overseas. Tolley also now offers 16 different satellite seminars led by alumni of our New York City program for educators in their home states. So many of you are familiar with the seminar in Massachusetts, which is led by Kara and Mamadou, who are both here. Others of you, if you haven't, I hope you'll visit our website and be in touch. So in addition to our work here in the US, Tolley also now holds another 9 seminars for teachers in Europe. As Jennifer has already said, the principles that underlie Tolley's work bring together Holocaust studies with a pedagogy that's based in writing and inquiry. As you'll notice during the workshop, writing and inquiry are critical components of the methods of Tolley faculty and their participants and the ways they bring their study of and teaching about the Holocaust to their students. We see these as central to helping teachers and students identify where they stand in relationship to this material, and we believe that in turn is crucial to sustaining them as they work on very difficult subjects. So having said a little bit about Tolley, I will happily introduce Kara and Sue. I am getting an unexpected screen share. I don't know if that's true for everyone.
Yeah.
It looks like it's Chris's. There we go. Okay.
I just can't focus. Okay. Great. So good. That's sort of broke my attention. Great. So I'm very happy now to introduce a few people. I'll introduce Cara and I'll introduce Sue, and then a little bit later on in the program, Jennifer Hallwit will introduce Professor Derek Pensler, who is with us from Harvard University. So Cara Crandall teaches middle school English in Long Meadow, Massachusetts, and has served as a facilitator for Tolley's seminar in Amherst, Massachusetts since 2015. Cara received her doctorate in 2016 from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst with a focus on language, literacy, and culture. She has taught in a variety of school settings and grade levels, including at the collegiate level for 7 years as Emerson College's Director of First Year Writing and as an adjunct at Westfield State University and Springfield College, where she continues work preparing new teachers for the classroom. Cara's research interests include gender, power relations, and the personal, societal, and ideological functions of narrative. Her publications include a chapter in Distracted Girls, School, and Sexuality, and the forthcoming Opportunities and Challenges in Holocaust Education, which I am pleased to say is a collection of essays by Tolley teachers and which I am co-editing. Cara also has other essays that explore adolescent literacy practices in the secondary classroom. And then it's really my great honor to introduce Sue Reeder. Sue has a background in history and art, and her interest in oral histories began one summer when she worked as a researcher in England. She holds an MA in art history from the University of California, Berkeley, and has worked at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and the Harvard University Art Museum. Her research focused on the social context of late 19th century photography and posters, and this work has helped inform Susan's approach to visual narratives and to historical subjects in video. Her introduction to filmmaking began as a researcher for the art history filmmaker Judith Wexler. Susan is grateful for her creative collaboration with Sam Kruger, her co-editor, who contributed to the later stages of Exile and Community, and her most recent film is A Making of Joe Wheeler, A Conquered Story. And with that, I am very happy to pass it to Sue.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Good afternoon, and thanks so much for coming. Given that's all that's happened in the moment, it's difficult for any of us to focus on the past, but I believe we need Carola's story now more than ever. As a young Jew growing up in Nazi Germany, Carola yearned for the social acceptance of her peers and for the German identity she once took for granted. She fled Germany in her late teens and came to this country on her own. Carola spent much of her life searching for a specific kind of community, one tied to nature and modernist ideals, and found it here in New England. Her story is at once unique, but also, sadly, representative. Carola provides a remarkable example for students, particularly in a time when much seems beyond our control. In the face of extreme adversity, she found inner strength and ultimately the capacity to forgive. Her story has compelling relevance given current concerns with preserving democracy. Her experience adds perspective to our problems with racism, anti-Semitism, and mass migration. Carola's account personalizes a critical moment in the past. It is largely set in the familiar context of school and sports, and is told from the point of view of a young person. In this way, it offers a fresh perspective on the Holocaust, and young people can identify with her. These are the reasons I believe her account is important. I've known from the beginning that I wanted to help tell her story. The curriculum guide, which accompanies this film, helps establish a context for Carola's story. It provides an overview of the Holocaust and describes what daily life for a school child was like under Hitler's rule. There are also sections on current events, commemorative art, and historiography as related to Carola's account. The film and guide can be accessed through the website susanreeder.com, and these materials should also be available online soon through the Concord Free Public Library. Thank you, Anka. I'm so excited that you've joined us here today. Thank you for your time and for your remarkable work as teachers. I'd also like to thank Tolly and Mass Humanities for supporting this project, and Kara Crandall, Jennifer Hallwit, and Derek Pensler for so generously offering their time and expertise. Finally, I'm exceedingly grateful to the teachers and scholars who worked so hard to create this guide. I would particularly like to thank James Young for offering his support and expertise in overseeing the guide. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sue. So let me just give you a quick overview of what today is going to look like. And then I'm going to introduce Professor Pensler. So Professor Pensler is going to speak for about 20 minutes or so. That should give us about maybe 10 minutes for questions. And then Kara is going to introduce the guide a little bit further, and in particular, its section on commemorative art and how to think about this film in relationship to the process of commemorating difficult moments in history. I think it very much connects to questions that we're all asking today in this country about monuments and how to memorialize the past. So Carol will be leading you through a reflective writing exercise, and then you'll be breaking up into some breakout rooms for about 15 minutes focused on some particular questions from the guide to sort of begin to sort of think through what it might look like to connect this film to these broader questions of commemorative art. So let me just introduce Professor Pensler. It's my honor to be able to introduce him to you. Derek Pensler is the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University. He's also taught at Indiana University, the University of Toronto, and Oxford University, where he served as the inaugural Stanley Lewis Professor of Modern Israel Studies. He's the president of the American Academy for Jewish Research and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Professor Pensler teaches and researches the history of Jews in modern Europe, North America, and Israel, and has published many books and scholarly articles. Some of the books that I thought might be of interest for those of you attending today, he's written a book called In Search of Jewish Community, Jewish Identities in Germany and Austria, 1918 to 1933. He's written a book called Contemporary Anti-Semitism, Canada and the World. And then just this year, with Yale University Press, he's published a book called Theodor Herzl, the Charismatic Leader. So Professor Pensler, I will pass the baton to you to get started.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Susan, for being in touch with me about this matter for so long. I'm going to now try to share a presentation, which hopefully will work. There it is. Okay, hopefully you see it. Do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Okay. So, 20 minutes is a long time or a short time to cover a huge subject. I just want to start by saying that the story of Carola's life is really an extraordinary story. And I think it's precisely because it is not representative of the Holocaust that it's so important. It must be very difficult for young people to be able to enter into the world of, say, someone who entered Auschwitz and who came out. It's difficult enough. But as Primo Levi wrote in his book, The Drowned and the Saved, we really have to remember that the overwhelming majority of Jews who entered that horror of the Holocaust never came out. 2/3 of the Jews of Europe were killed, 90% of the Jews of Poland were killed. And Carola's story is a story of someone who, as she says, with great honesty and great courage throughout the film, was very lucky in that she did get out and she didn't experience the Holocaust. And she reminds me very much of my own family. And I just wanted to begin on a personal note that I'm rather distantly related to a man named Ernst Drucker, who became known as Ernest Drucker. Born in Cologne, a gifted violinist who was performing the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto when stormtroopers, in 1934, when stormtroopers stopped the performance, forced him off the stage. He wound up in the he was offered a job in Palestine, didn't take it, played in Nazi-funded orchestras for the Jüdisches Kulturbund, the Jewish Cultural Association, wound up in the States in 1938 and became a very gifted, successful violinist, including a longtime position as concertmaster of the New York Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. His son, Eugene Drucker, is a prominent violinist, founder of the Emerson Quartet, and made a point of going to Israel a few years ago and playing precisely the final movements of the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto that his own father had not been allowed to play in 1934. It was a very moving moment in Ra'anana in Israel. So this is the story of part of my family as well, someone who suffered for sure, but he got away. And in a way, the stories of those who did suffer persecution are a little easier maybe to understand than those of the millions who did not. So what can I offer in about 17 minutes? I want to talk about the kind of hatred that was directed against Carola, a young, innocent girl who did nothing to deserve the hatred that was spewed at her. How did it happen that Jews were the objects of not just casual bigotry, not just snobbishness? I mean, there's always intergroup rivalries and dislike, but a point where Jews are considered so noxious, so dangerous, so horrible that German society cannot even tolerate them in their midst. And that's what I want to focus on in the little bit of time I have. And my point is really quite simple, although it might be a little counterintuitive, which is that although anti-Semitism is a perversion of goodness, it's a perversion of morality, it's a perversion of religion, I believe that anti-Semitism is a deeply religious phenomenon. It's religious in the sense that it represents a search for understanding of things that are beyond most people's ken. It's religious in the sense that it is often very closely tied to Christianity and Islam themselves. And it's religious, most importantly, in that for the Nazis and for those who went along that path in the 20th century, anti-Semitism is a search for redemption. Redemption from a world that is imperfect, where we feel disempowered and victimized. And by associating everything that we find incomprehensible or disagreeable with the Jews, we attain a kind of, or we hope to attain a kind of a salvation. It is very much an inversion and a perversion of what religion should be. The fact is that we cannot understand the anti-Semitism of Hitler's Germany, whether or not it used Christian language, without the Christian underpinnings of Jew hatred. Long before the word anti-Semitism was invented, it was only invented in the 1870s. People used the term Judenhass, or Jew hatred, or Judeophobia, and it was based originally in the notion that Jews had rejected Jesus, had actually conspired and abetted his crucifixion, and that for Jews to reject their own Messiah, sent to them by their God, must have been not merely the result of ignorance, but of malevolence. And one sees this in writings by fathers of the Christian church going back to the beginning of the Common Era, but it becomes especially pronounced from the 12th century onward, that Jews are accused, again, not merely of being ignorant or stubborn, but downright malevolent. And the most heinous accusation you can make against someone you don't like, from a member of a hated group, is that they abuse children. We see this today in the QAnon conspiracy, which is taking off like wildfire throughout the world. It's based on the notion that there are liberal, democratic, satanic worshiping pedophiles, and it sounds ridiculous. But if we realize that actually many times in history, people have accused members of groups that they hate of precisely this kind of crime, of abusing, sexually molesting, killing children, because it is the most heinous thing one can do, is to harm a child. And I think this is precisely why in the Middle Ages, Jews were accused of killing Christian children and ritually consuming their blood. Again, what is the greatest taboo for humanity, aside from abusing children, is consuming human flesh and human blood. So these accusations, here we have one classic medieval woodcut, of Jews engaging in this kind of literally satanic behavior, I think it's something that leaves behind a mark. Even if anti-Semites in the 19th and 20th century don't always explicitly refer to these Christian origins, I think that the origins are there. That the Christian sees the Jew, to a much lesser extent in the Islamic world, the Muslim can see the Jew as not just stubborn, but really evil and destructive. And this gets secularized, this idea gets secularized in the 19th century with economic arguments that Jews are unusually, preternaturally gifted for business, for banking, but that their economic powers are parasitical, that they're not merely wealthy people who contribute to the national economy, but that they're downright parasitical and malevolent. So here we see Nazi-era propaganda about the, here talks about the Jewish spirit, which undermines the healthy powers of Germandom. And here we see the Jews who are, quite demonic, diabolic in their appearance, in their hands, and in their faces. So that mixture of the kind of older Christian anti-Semitism and the idea that the Jew is a kind of parasitical force in a healthy European society. This long predates Nazism, and it extends far above and beyond it. Because one thing I want to make clear is that there was not a country in the Western world in modern history where Jews were not subject to anti-Semitism, and where myths of Jewish economic parasitism, of Jewish malevolence were not to be found, including the United States. There was not a country in the Western world in modern times where there was never violence against Jews. It happened everywhere, absolutely everywhere, much less in the United States, much less in the United Kingdom, but it did happen in both of those countries, somewhat more in France, somewhat more still in Germany, and in the late 19th, early 20th century, the greatest extent of anti-Jewish violence took place in Russia. So accusations that Jews were responsible for the ills of humanity became quite universal in the 19th century. The ideas really originated not so much in the German lands, but in France. Here we see a caricature from the mid-19th century of a bunch of Jews dancing around a golden calf. So the story from the book of Exodus. And what is the golden calf? It is the banknotes of the Crédit Immobilier, which was a joint stock bank that went bankrupt in France in the mid-19th century. And the bankruptcies were blamed on Jews. The inevitable bubbles and bursts, credit bubbles of modern capitalism were blamed on the small number of Jews in the overall scheme of banking and finance in the 19th century. But associating Jews with the evils of capitalism, and also at the same time in the late 19th century, ironically associating Jews with socialism and communism. In both cases, there was some reality to it. Yes, there were Jewish bankers in the 19th century, and yes, there were Jews who got involved in radical socialist movements, but these movements and these phenomena extend way beyond the Jews, and they would have, of course, happened without Jews. The common element here, and this is why I think it's ultimately a religious issue and not simply a secular one, is the idea of the Jew as a universal solvent, as the destroyer of everything that is good and holy, whether you come from it, whether you come at it from the Jew as capitalist or the Jew as communist. Or in the late 19th century, yet another way of attacking the Jew as a member of an inferior race that could be identified by skull shape, by the shape of the nose, by all sorts of features, and that genetically Jews actually represented an inferior species or subspecies, and that this could be quantified scientifically. I want to make very clear that whether we talk about the religious aspect, the economic aspect, or the racial aspect, what all of these have in common is that anti-Semites in the 19th and 20th centuries don't just hate Jews, they're afraid of them. They are deathly afraid of them, because they don't merely say that Jews are ethically or spiritually inferior. In some ways, the anti-Semite assumes that the Jew is superior. The Jew is crafty, clever, intelligent, wily. These are notions that really belie attributing anti-Semitism to hatred alone. The Jew can destroy everything. The Jew here, the Père Juif, common anti-Semitic trope from the late 19th century, the Jew as a conspirator, seeking to conquer the world and actually doing a pretty good job of it. This was embodied in the most notorious anti-Semitic forgery of the modern era, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, composed in what is today Moldova in the early 1900s in a Russian language that was heavily Ukrainianized. So we've finally, in the last 5-10 years, been able to identify who wrote it. But it spread like wildfire throughout the Russian Empire, Germany, France, the United States. Here we see it being published in Chicago, Illinois. The protocols were sponsored and published largely thanks to financial support from Henry Ford, who believed in the Jewish financial conspiracy quite completely. The protocols made their way to the Middle East, translated by a Roman Catholic cleric in Palestine or in Lebanon in 1926. And today, I've been told, I haven't been to the Amman airport, but I've been told you can buy the protocols in the Amman airport or in Riyadh. So this is very widespread. What do the protocols say? That Jews are a conspiratorial group. They get together in a cabal on periodic bases in the cemetery, in the Jewish cemetery in Prague, and they plot global domination. So anti-Semitism then is really based on fear. So if this is everywhere, what's the particular aspect of Germany? What are the particular characteristics that make anti-Semitism so virulent in Germany in the 20th century? Germany had a variety of political and social and economic problems before the 20th century, but ultimately I think one has to look at not only anti-Semitism before, let's say, World War I. Germany had plenty of anti-Semitism before World War I, but the unexpected loss of the war in World War I left Germans searching, and what I'm going to say now might have a lot of contemporary parallels. Germans expected to win the war. They had not been told that they would not win the war, and when at the last minute the German military collapsed, the only possible response that many German patriots could come up with was that they were stabbed in the back. That victory was stolen from them, like the stolen election of 2020. This was the stolen victory, the stab in the back, or the Dolchstoßlegende. The idea was that from the very beginning of the post-1918 period, the German government that was established in its wake, the Republican form of government, small r, that replaced the monarchy, must have been illegitimate. It was conceived illegitimate from the start because it was based on a stolen victory. And so obviously we see a lot of parallels with our own time. And this is why anti-Semitism in the later 1920s and 1930s in Germany, it's not merely disliking Jews because they allegedly have undue economic influence, or disliking Jews because they allegedly have undue influence in the communist or the socialist parties. There's something much more than that. And I didn't coin the term redemptive anti-Semitism. I owe it to a colleague from University of California at Los Angeles named Saul Friedlander, who wrote a wonderful and important book about the persecution of the Jews in Nazi Germany and then their annihilation during the Second World War. And he used the term redemptive anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism is a way for Germans emerging from the loss of World War I, the social and economic chaos that followed, hyperinflation, civil strife between communists and the right wing, that there must be an answer. There must be a solution, and the solution lies in getting rid of the Jews. Here we see stormtroopers boycotting a Jewish store, and what does the sign say? Deutsche, wehrt euch, defend yourselves. So this is not just we hate Jews, it's we have to defend ourselves from them, because the Jews and the anti-Semitic mentality are actually the stronger party. A colleague of mine named Alain Confino has written a powerful book called A World Without Jews, in which the notion of getting rid of Jews becomes messianic. And here we see the town of Hildesheim, Juden hier in Hildesheim unerwünscht, Jews in this town are not desired. My colleague has collected photographs like this from small towns and cities throughout Germany in the 1930s, boasting of the fact that Jews no longer live in the town, and seeing in this the beginning of a new and better era. Redemption involves displays of rituals, rallies, performances of obedience and a willingness to sacrifice, and destruction. Redemption demands of people sacrifice. And here we see a display, May of 1933, a few months after Hitler has become chancellor, of a mass rally in Berlin and the burning of books that were thought to be hostile to the values of National Socialism, many of them written by leftists, many of them written by Jews. And again, the idea in this, obviously a ceremony that has a kind of inverse religious structure and aesthetic, that redemption will follow. Once that path has started, and this is, of course, Carola's experience, then it's very hard to stop, because if the Jew is the universal solvent, the only thing one can do is to remove the Jew from one's midst. In 1935, the Jews were deprived of citizenship in Germany, according to the notorious Nuremberg laws. Intermarriages, sexual relationships between Jews and Gentiles were made illegal. And the dynamic kept on going and kept on going, with Jews being further and further extruded from the body politic in the search for redemption. The problem that Nazism had, that the most virulent forms of anti-Semitism have, is that if Jews are that evil, if Jews are that clever, then there's always the risk that we might be outsmarted by them. And so in 1938, this children's book was written to be used in German schools called Der Giftpilz, the toadstool, to help German children identify Jews, just as you have to identify a toadstool and not eat it, as opposed to, say, a healthy edible mushroom. So here we see lessons, how to identify a Jew. And these are translations from the German. The Jewish nose is bent. It looks like a number 6. This is how you can tell that somebody who might seem quite nice is actually a Jew. And here we see kind of stereotypical image of the Jew as a banker sitting on a sack of money. But what I want to point out is the image in the book that comes next. What comes next is a notion of the Jew as a kind of hypersexual seducer of Aryan Jewish women, an accusation that's often made against outgroups. In the United States, this accusation was made in the Old South against African Americans, and in the United Kingdom, it was made against Irish people, that they're oversexed. But the key thing is that the Jew will always remain Jewish. Nothing can change it. The Jew might convert to Christianity, but still remains different, separate, and fundamentally evil. And what's really interesting about this book, Der Giftpilz, is look how it ends. It ends with a Christian image. What Christ said about the Jews, remember the gruesome act committed by the Jews on Golgotha. Without solving the Jewish question, says Julius Streicher at the end of the book, there's no salvation for mankind. I rest my case. Anti-Semitism as a deeply religious, albeit obscenely religious, or an obscene perversion of religion, search for redemption, which explains, again, the greatest perversion in the history of Germany in the 1930s is the destruction of Jewish synagogues. 1938, we just commemorated the anniversary of Kristallnacht. And poor Carola, this innocent young girl, teenager, is subjected to all of this. All of the weight of the hatred, which she was able to escape the worst of it, because with this I finish. Half the Jews in Germany got away, half didn't. Half the Jews in Austria got away, half didn't. And for the Jews who were left behind comes this chilling speech from Heinrich Himmler, delivered in Posen, in an area that had been Germany and became Poland and becomes Germany again, in 1943, in which he talks openly to a group of SS officers about the annihilation of the Jews. He says, we are going to talk about the extermination of the Jews. The Nazis did not keep this quiet and did not hide this. There's a myth about Nazis trying to hide the Holocaust from the German people. They did not. What Himmler says is that we're going to kill the Jews, but the important thing is that you have remained, as he says here, decent, because we know how difficult things would be if we still had Jews as secret saboteurs, agitators, and instigators. We'd be back in World War I if the Jews still resided in the German body politic. But he's saying, thank God we've gotten rid of them. And because we've gotten rid of them, we might be able to win this war, but we can only do so if we destroy every last one of them. And this is absolutely chilling. We have the moral right, we have the duty to kill this people. Who would kill us? Because after all, anti-Semitism is based on fear. And then he makes the ultimate hypocritic statement that we will not enrich ourselves, as he says here, by one fur with one marker, one cigarette, through the persecution and killing of Jews. We don't want to get sick and die from the bacillus we've exterminated. A colleague of mine has called the Holocaust a robbery murder. The Jews were pillaged, the Jews were exploited, and the corruption, the venality of the Nazi regime was sickening. But he says here at the very end, we have carried out this most difficult task for the love of our people. We have suffered no defect within us, in our soul, in our character. Again, a perversion of religiosity, but something that becomes just as powerful as the most fanatical form of religious devotion. Obviously, anti-Semitism does not always reach those levels. It is often much more subclinical. But to understand why a poor, innocent, not poor, I mean, she was well off financially, but a innocent, beautiful, young Jewish girl was subject to such irrational hatred. We have to put it in this much bigger framework of anti-Semitism as a search for redemption. So it's been 22 minutes, so I'll stop right there, and I look forward to your questions. I'll stop this, I'll open that, I'll do that, I'll go to speaker gallery view. Okay, anyway.
Great, so we're a small group, so I think anyone who has a question, if you just want to unmute yourself.
It's always like this in seminar. Nobody wants to be the first person to ask a question. I've started cold calling on my students. I just tell them I'm going to cold call them. Except for at Harvard, they call it warm calling.
I was going to say, I was somewhat surprised about the religious connection. I didn't, for some reason, and maybe it's because I'm flipping communism and fascism in my head, but I didn't realize that church and the Christian faith was promoted in the Nazi regime. Was that a very strong force there?
I think there's been a lot of disinformation since World War II by the Christian churches. Although the Christian churches did provide some resistance against Nazism and against Hitler, there were two branches of the, well, first of all, the Roman Catholic Church in Nazi Germany was simply quiet. There was plenty of anti-Semitism within the Catholic Church, but within the Lutheran Church, there was one branch that was nominally independent, but usually politically quiescent, and there was another branch that was avowedly pro-Nazi. And my colleague Susanna Heschel at Dartmouth has written about this extensively. And I just read an article of hers about this, where Germans, good middle-class Germans, would go on Sunday morning to services, and they would hear some kind of thundering sermon against the Jews. And they would come out, and the preacher didn't tell them to go out and kill the Jews or to boycott their businesses or whatever, but it would be, about the perfidy of the Jews. And it would give them a sense of moral righteousness. And then if they, whether actively or tacitly, supported Nazi policies, they felt that they were operating in a Christian framework. So the fact is that, the Wehrmacht had pastors in every unit. There were religious services were held regularly. And it's true that Nazism had a pagan mythological framework, but the fact is that the middling, sort of the SS officer corps and the Wehrmacht officer corps, many of them were churchgoers. So yes, I think there is a very strong connection. And historically, there's a very deep connection. And although anti-Semitism takes on a secular kind of coloring in the 19th century, becomes more economic, more cultural, I think it's religious in two senses of the word. One is that it does have this Christian element, and the other is when it gets to the point that you are going to, make war against an entire people, which involves losses. The Germans themselves lose millions during World War II. Then this has to be seen in a kind of religious language of a crusade. So that's why I think the religious argument is useful. It's disturbing, but it's useful.
Any other questions?
This is more of a comment than a question, but since we're together with a community of teachers, I just really appreciate that framing that, as we go into the film or we look at other narratives, that this is not a foregone turn in history, right? I think it's one of the most challenging pieces around teaching about the Holocaust. Try to remember that there might have been another path. This wasn't always destined to happen, right? For students, it's such a big historical event that they come in with some kind of prior knowledge about, right? Whether that's from pop culture or wherever. Return them to a place of, I think Peter Hayes called it unknowing, like they have to unlearn, and just hearing you speak about it is like, right, it didn't have to be like this, right? It's such a basic principle, but how do we communicate to our students, a kind of openness to envision the foundation of how this happens and why, and the idea that it doesn't have to. So
and that's a really key question.
Yeah.
Really key question. I mean, look, the greatest tragedy about the Holocaust is that it didn't have to happen. Let's say it had to happen. This is just, human nature is such as it is, that there was no choice. That would be very depressing. And we'd feel disempowered, but we would say, okay, fine, this is what it means to be a human being. Absolutely not. Every step of the way, there were choices. And I think the most important single thing that can prevent these sorts of tragedies from happening is honesty and transparency. If people were honest about the social problems that confronted, let's say, Germans or French people or wherever in the 19th century, honest about what the real sources of their problems were, rather than looking to blame it on Jews or someone else. If there had been honesty after World War I, why the collapse on the Western Front? Why the defeat at the Second Battle of the Marne? But we see this now, I mean, where either people are intentionally lying because they want to attain or cling to power, or whether it's because they begin to believe their own rhetoric, I'm not sure. But honesty would have prevented the Holocaust. It's like, I know that historians we can't change the world, but I'd like to think that the one thing we can do as historians is to catch people at lying and to at least hold people up to account for their falsehoods. Because people believe, because they've been, I forget, it was August Bebel, a German socialist, who famously said that anti-Semitism is the socialism of stupid people. Let's look at the real problems and what's causing them. And that kind of honesty could have done a great deal. And I'm hoping moving forward in human history, we will embrace honesty, even if it's painful.
Hi, this is Mamadou here, and I'm gonna bring you to the curriculum. That's where I always go. I tend to consider the hidden curriculum as a very as an obstacle to telling the truth. I know schools of teacher preparation have a preference for being nice to avoid talking about difficult subjects to teacher candidates here, and then this continues into being in service teachers, and we avoid talking about the curriculum in difficult ways as if it's a consensus, and it's not a consensus. It's drawn up by a very few group of people with particular interests or goals that they want to promote in the curriculum to reproduce the the status quo. So I don't know how you put it in the context of what you're talking about here. If you can maybe say something about that.
I can only talk about what happens in the university, where I have to deal with this all the time. And the problem with honesty is that when it comes to a very complicated issue, like, why was there an economic crisis in 2008 or something, 2007, there isn't one answer. So my real specialty, when I'm not doing European Jewish history, I work on Israel-Palestine, which, as you know, is just a bit controversial. And I make it clear to my students that there's more than one right answer, that honesty, transparency, candor, and so forth, good faith, does not mean that everyone's going to come to the same place. They may very well wind up in different places. The fact that they came to it through honesty and sincerity, though, will, I think, prevent them from going into the extremes. They will wind up, and my students and my colleagues, we are divided politically on this issue. But the way I like to put it is, when you approach the issue of Israel-Palestine with sincerity and openness, you might be on opposite sides of a line, but you can see each other and you can hear each other. You're not that far apart. You can shout at each other across the border, as it were. And I don't know how much of that can be done in a high school situation. I know that I do it in a university situation, small classes, and the students, for the most part, are willing to buy in to that. Also, they don't have to be in my class, right? These aren't required classes. So I'm getting a self-selected group. Whereas in high school, and I have taught high school a bit, you're getting students who are there for, they have to be there. And so on the other hand, in my experience, high school students are a lot more fun to teach because they're more spirited and they're more willing to talk. Harvard undergraduates are terrified of, what if I say the wrong thing or whatever. And so it takes a while to break down those barriers. So I don't know if my experience can be exported to the high school level.
Thank you.
Kara, I think that's maybe a good transition point to, maybe pass it on to you to begin, helping us all think about what it does look like to take this subject into the classroom, you know, to take a film like this and connect it to things going on today.
Thank you. I was actually thinking the exact same thing with Derek's last point. I said, well, my answer to that would be, and for the teachers in the room, you can sort of chime in if you disagree, but students appreciate it when we take them seriously and when we take them into places where they have to grapple with things that matter. And there's probably nothing that matters more than this question of what does it mean to be a human being, and how do we figure out the world that we are inheritors of and a part of. So the portion of the program now will be more directed for those of you who are teachers, and to think about how you could use the curriculum guide in your classroom as well as the film. One of the things that we talk a lot about at Tolle, as Jennifer Lenberg mentioned, is how do we try to teach students and work with students around issues that are incredibly vast and as complex, both historically and intellectually and also emotionally, as the Holocaust. And again, for classroom teachers here, you know that we are all always looking over our shoulder because we are concerned about what happens when we open up conversations about difficult subjects. How do we do that? And how do we help students, whether they're middle school like I teach or into high school, start to think about a subject that is so incredibly vast? You know, I sometimes say to my students, we could spend the rest of our lives studying the Holocaust and we would never know everything that happened. We would never, ever know all of the information, nor would we ever come to a complete understanding. So how do we get students to start to do that? So at Tolle, and certainly my own work, we talk about looking at individuals. The Holocaust doesn't happen to just millions of people. The Holocaust happens to individuals. A colleague of ours from Tolle, who also is at the Holocaust Museum and Memorial in Washington, says there are not 6 million murders. There is one murder, and it happens 6 million times, over and over and over again. So we want our students to think about an individual. And the film about Carola offers us that. It offers us a teenage girl who is forced to confront the most heinous acts. And interestingly, this particular film, as a teacher, I find very helpful because it tells us the story of what happens after. And for my students, they always want to know what happens after. How do people come back from this? What is the life afterwards? Where do people go? What happens for people who are survivors? And we get that story through this film. And so I definitely find it incredibly helpful as a teacher to have that breadth in this one particular film. So at Tolle, as Jennifer Lenberg also mentioned, we do use writing as a form of inquiry, both into the subject, but also into ourselves. Because there's absolutely no way to have students work with difficult subjects, especially the Holocaust, without giving them a safe space to place their emotions. This is not, you know, all of teaching requires a stance, right? And for our students, when we ask them to think about a subject, we're asking them to have a relationship with this material. And the Holocaust is going to call up all sorts of feelings and responses that are emotional for any human being, but in particular for students who, like in the community where I teach, are Jewish. For students who know in their family's history, they have some personal connection, as Derek talked about. So we want students to understand that this work necessitates an intellectual approach, but it also does necessitate an emotional approach, that there has to be an ability to make space for that as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to lead us through a free write. And for those of you who don't know what that is, I'm going to post a prompt, and it is in relationship to the film. So it's going with the idea that you've seen the film, and I'll give you about 5, 6, 7 minutes to just respond to this question. And it allows us a way to ground ourselves and respond without sharing with others where we are right now. And then we'll move into one particular section of the curriculum guide and go into the breakout groups. So I'm going to hopefully share my screen. And you will need a piece of paper, something to write with, or you certainly could do this on whatever device you have with you. So at the beginning of the curriculum guide, we have this quotation from Elie Wiesel: "The Holocaust. Only those who were there know what it was. The others will never know. It was easier for Auschwitz inmates to imagine themselves free than for free persons to imagine themselves in Auschwitz. What then is the answer? How is one to tell a tale that cannot be, but must be told? How is one to protect the memory of the victims?" So the question for you, and again, if you want to just respond in writing, how does the film attempt to answer these questions and tensions that Wiesel raises here? And I'm going to give you about 5 to 6 minutes to just think through that for yourself. If you haven't looked at the guide in its totality, this is where the guide begins. And whether it's applied directly to the film or not, I think it raises a lot of questions and, again, tensions that you could explore with your students. So this particular free write is a way to ground us and prepare us, but it's given us a space that's personal and is a place where we could just sort of write out where we start. And then in terms of thinking about the curriculum guide, I would offer to you, again, if you haven't had a chance to look at it in its totality, that it is both a work in whole and a work in parts. Each of the parts would allow you to work with the film coming from very specific angles. And when Jennifer and Sue and I were talking about the presentation, we decided to focus on section 4, which is the commemorative art section, because as Jennifer mentioned earlier, it has so much resonance for many of the issues that we've been exploring in the United States of late. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna focus in on the Stapelstein, which again is explored in section 4, and we're going to look at the questions that are in that section. And then Jennifer is gonna put you into breakout rooms so that you can then, with small group, address a few of the questions and talk through them. And she is going to put a document into the chat, that the link to a Google Doc, where you will access all of the questions and both of the photographs I'm about to show you. We would ask you for today, because we only have 2 groups, if you could please, group 1, you will focus on question 1, and group 2, you're gonna focus on question 2. There are 5 questions that are a part of this work. And we've decided to focus in on these 2 particular questions because they do allow us a way to kind of counterpoint, thinking about this particular piece of commemorative art. So let me just go back to the PowerPoint. And as you will see, again, in the movie and in the curriculum guide, the Stapelstein, or the stumbling stones, Carola is the recipient of one. She is remembered in one, and this is hers. And if I remember correctly, Sue, correct me if I'm wrong, please. It is right outside of her school in Frankfurt. Am I right? Yes, thank you so much. And then here again is a photograph of the way the Stapelstein becomes interactive. It is in public. It is on the sidewalk. So again, both of these photographs are in the document that Jennifer has shared with you. So then these are the 5 questions that are in this particular section of the curriculum guide. And again, if you're in group 1, we would ask you to think through and talk through the questions for group 1. And then in group 2, again, you're gonna go with those questions. And if you could come back ready to maybe give us a little summary, or one person can tell us kind of how the discussion went and where you ended up focusing. And if you want to, you can certainly address any of the other questions, 3, 4, or 5. Does anybody have any questions about what you're about to do? Oops, I'm gonna stop my share. Okay, so Jennifer, can we go into breakout rooms?
Yes, and just want to make sure that everybody has found the Google link that's in the chat. You want to click on it now before going into the breakout rooms, because it won't, your chat, it may not still be there when you go into the breakout room. So has everybody clicked on that? And you know, if you have trouble putting yourself in, to two windows so you can kind of have the Google Doc open when you're in the breakout room. Any one person in your group can share a screen when you're in the breakout room if you want to share the Google Doc with everybody else to get at that question. And if you have any problems in your small group and you want me to come in, there'll be a help button that you'll see when you get into the breakout room. You don't see it now, but when you get in there, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to call for help, and I can come and, if there's any kind of a problem, I'm happy to come in and sort out whatever needs to be done. So we have two groups, and I think I'm just gonna sort of press go. You'll see a window that'll come up inviting you to press join the group. You'll press that. Again, pay attention to what your group number is. That'll tell you which question you're going to be answering. And I'm going to put you all into breakout rooms right now.
And you have about 10 minutes. Like to share with us regarding your question, and I'll just read it just for everybody. In what ways is a memorial like the Stoppelstein important in today's society? Does it contribute to telling a tale to our future generations, and how so? So is anybody who was in group one that wants to share with us what your discussion was about? Where you sort of ended up, where you started?
We weren't sure if we were group one. Were we group one? Because it said we're going into room 3, and there were 3 of us.
Oh, I didn't even think about that, right? Because I put Derek in a room with Levin, and so they were group one.
Okay. So then I'll go to plan B, which is those of you.
It was a wonderful group.
So those of you who were in groups discussing the questions, what did you come up with? What were some of the ideas that you bandied around? Where did you end up? Where did you start? Who wants to share?
I'll be quick, and I probably said too much in my group, but I talked a little bit about the fact that I'm German. I'm a German citizen, actually, still today, and I grew up in Germany. And I actually spent part of my childhood living in Frankfurt, although I lived other parts of the country. But I spent a lot of time in Frankfurt, actually, through high school, college, grad school, just visiting with family and friends. So I'm very familiar with the Stoppelsteine, and talked about how, as a German, it's, how can I say? It's a very, very powerful reminder and a narrative, of walking and seeing it, in one's daily life, not just as a visitor, but just, I'm going to the store to get milk, or I'm going shopping, and I'm reminded in how powerful that is. And I was saying to the group that, Frankfurt still has a sizable Jewish community, and I think they've worked really hard to maintain that community, and they have a beautiful cemetery. So actually, a good friend of mine that lives in Frankfurt and we always, we visit. It's near her house, actually. But anyway, so I kind of gushed out because I just thought, to me, these are very, very powerful. And I also want to say, Professor Penzler, in your presentation, there was a sign that you showed that said, from Hildesheim, Juden nicht erlaubt. And the grandparents on my father's side, that's where they lived, in Hildesheim. So I used to visit there a lot. So those things, so it's a different perspective and different experience, but very powerful.
And do you feel like your response is fairly typical for other people that live in Frankfurt? Do you think that's how many people feel or interact when they are walking through the city streets?
I think it really depends. I think one story I shared, again, my grandparents, only passed away about 20 years ago. But I was very close to them and spent a lot of time with them. And my mother's grandparents lived outside of Dortmund. So, I spent parts of every summer, really almost through college and part of grad school in Germany and being with family. I think it's a generational thing. I think I talked about, well, first of all, I really didn't learn anything about the Holocaust growing up in Germany. So I came to the United States in high school. I don't think I knew much about that at all, really. I don't know if that had ever come up. I'm sorry to say. And certainly then when I moved to the United States, and I actually went to UMass Amherst for my BA in MA in history, and I was telling my group that I remember sitting in the student union at UMass Amherst in the early 80s, watching Shoah, hours of it. So, they ran it for, I don't know, a weekend, and I attended a lot of those. And I think, again, that's something I said to the group, also answering the question is, it's those personal stories that make it so powerful. We can all read books with statistics and maps, and but seeing those personal stories, that was really powerful. And going back to Germany after that semester for the summer vacation, I would try to start conversations, especially with my grandfather. And again, Professor Penzler, as you said, things weren't a secret, but my grandfather insisted that he had no idea, that they were never told. Even though my parents, my grandparents lived very close to a work camp, as it was called. So yeah. And then going back to the Stolpersteine and the experience, even my mom was born in 1941. It's very hard for her to talk about it. We talk about it sometimes. Very hard for her to talk about it.
Thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else in your groups? Anything that you want to share? Okay, so I'm gonna.
Caroline.
Go ahead, Mamadou. Sorry.
No, Caroline. She was a moderator. She will summarize for us.
Caroline, excuse me, Caroline. You are a familiar face. It's wonderful to see you. What was being discussed in your group?
Our group was talking about what was controversial about these stepping stones and how seeing an individual name and date causes you to pause. Like if you're at a graveyard and you do that kind of mental arithmetic where you say, okay, they were this old, they lived for this long, and this was the time period they lived in. And when you have that pause, it causes you to reflect on this individual. And then I was talking about how here in Texas, this is very timely because I teach art in Texas to 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. And this last election, kids, especially in Texas, are choosing sides. And it, in Texas, has become very, very visual. They have masks, they have flags, they're riding around with pickup trucks with all kinds of flags festooned. And I remember having a conversation with a child or a student who had been on the baseball team with my son. And I said, hey, listen, I don't know if you realize this, but I feel like the flags that you're flying in the back of your pickup truck are saying something about you that maybe you don't realize, where you're thinking this is patriotic and wonderful. I'm seeing the Confederate flag and other people are seeing the Confederate flag and they're thinking that you're a racist. Is that really what you want to do? Is that really what you're saying about yourself? And the response was like the middle finger to me. And it's not that necessarily that's what the kid wants to say, but that, you know, this is my heritage, we're part of the Confederacy, this is this glorious past. And rather than look at it in an individual term, we're looking at this big, broad spectrum of glory and patriotism and, you know, heroism. And I think it's nice to be confronted on an individual scale. And I wish that's what was happening here, because we live, I'm in Kennedale, Texas, which is in between Dallas, Fort Worth, and Mansfield. And Mansfield is where the book Black Like Me was written, where there's separate sidewalks even to this day. You know, and I wish that there were plaques stating why there's a separate sidewalk, so that people were confronted on a daily with, hey, this was really recent. And so that's what our group was talking about, is like these things we're seeing on a daily and how we would talk about this in our classroom.
Thanks, that's great. So to sort of tie things together and wrap things up, I love this idea that we're coming back to of personalizing and looking at individual stories, because when we do that with our students, it forces them to look at themselves as an individual, as Carolyn just said in her speaking. So we're asking all of our students to be able to look out at this historical event and then narrowing it down into the lives of individuals like Carola, but then to look at ourselves as individuals and not only parts of systems and nations, but in fact as an individual who has agency and gets to make decisions about what I understand about the world I inherit, and also how I see myself working through that world and being agentive in it. And when you all were in your breakout groups, we were having a really wonderful conversation, and one of the points that Jennifer Lemberg meant was that one of the beauties of the work that we do as teachers is we invite into classroom spaces where stories can be told. And for those who have died, who were murdered in the Holocaust, and those who survived like Carola, the story must be told. Because isn't that what all of us want, is our story to be told? And so we allow students then to also tell their own stories. And again, to place themselves in the world that they are a part of, in a world that they inherit. So I'm gonna wrap up now and just again remind you that the curriculum guide and the film are offered to you. And please share them, those of you who are teachers, with your colleagues who are teachers in your school and in other areas, because I think this film has so much resonance and really a lot of applicability for teachers, whether they're teaching ethics, as someone mentioned, government, history, and certainly English language arts.
Thank you, Karen. Derek, any closing thoughts that you have, having listened a little bit to what people talked about in their groups?
No, I found it all very interesting. I know that the Stolpersteine have been hugely, I think, popular might not be the right word, but well received in Germany. Although ironically, the Munich community, I don't know if have they accepted them in Munich, or are they still, what was it, Charlotte Knoblauch, right, was against it, the head of the Gemeinde. And I think she said something about trotting on the, trotting on the names of the dead. Mm-hmm. But I can tell you from personal experience, having spent 3 months in Berlin last spring, that my wife, who doesn't know German things or German Jewish things terribly well, the Stolpersteine were a source of fascination for her and a friend of hers. And wherever they stopped and looked at the stones, other people stopped and looked at the stones. And they work. They're very effective. It speaks well. And it makes me wonder really about the statistics I see that, a large percentage of Jews in the United States or whatever have never even, don't know about the Holocaust. If you scratch under the surface and you look at those statistics a bit more closely, the levels of ignorance aren't quite as bad as you might think. So it's actually, maybe it's a little bit alarmist, but no, I think the Stolpersteine are a wonderfully effective tool. And I'm just very glad that you have produced this initiative. I'm delighted to have been a part of it. And I'd be very interested in knowing how it moves forward.
Great, thank you. Sue.
I just want to say a few closing remarks. I want to, first of all, thank you for coming today. I do appreciate how very busy you all are. My greatest wish in regards to this project is to share Carola's experience with young people, and that's why I'm so grateful that you're here today. At this point, I'd like to quickly introduce Carola's daughters, Erica Vanderelp and Ali Domar, who I've come to know them better and better through various screenings. And I'm so delighted to have connected with them. Ali is a psychologist and Erica is a retired secondary school math teacher. And as you know, Ali appears in the film. Both speak really eloquently about their mother's experience, and they are willing to meet with your students to talk about their mom. They can do so via Zoom or possibly come into the classroom depending on whether circumstances allow that. They help bring this story alive. And I think Jennifer mentioned that Mass Humanities will be providing their contact information in a follow-up email to you. So without further ado, Erica and Ali, I'm hoping you can say hi. And I don't know if you guys can stick around for a little bit longer, but if you have any questions for Ali or Erica, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, I know we invited them at the last minute, and so we've gone a little over time, but if you're all willing, we can take a few extra minutes. And I know I would love to hear from both of you.
Happy to answer any questions.
I have a question. So Ali, from your perspective, what are your hopes for what the movie can do and how it can be used by teachers? Sort of what's your vision and hope?
I think one of the things our mother would say over and over again was never again. I mean, I think she lived in fear that something like the Holocaust could happen again. And she, she was literally dying. I know I say this in the movie, when she went to Germany to speak at her school. And she did that, and I was with her until she got to Germany, because she felt, and she felt so strongly that children needed to hear what actually happened, and that no one could cover it up or whatever. And she would, I think she spoke at Milton Academy, right, Rick? Yeah. She would go around schools and churches and tell her story. And when everyone would say, "Why are you doing this again?" She'd always say, "Never again. It can't happen again."
I wish she had come to my school.
I would add to that often when we screen the video, people ask what our mother would say about the current state of the world. And every time I say, I'm glad she's not here to see it. And every time that answer actually, although I'm saying the same words, what's behind it is changing and becoming worse. So I'm even more glad to say today that I'm glad she can't see what's happening than I was the last time I said it. I think she would be horrified at what's happening in the world today. And the only thing that she could have thought to maybe act against it is for people to hear her story, because maybe that will help a little bit.
Yeah. And it was hard for her to tell her story. I mean, she got very emotional every time she did. So it wasn't something she enjoyed doing. It was something that she felt obligated to do.
Do I remember the two of you talking about, that racial discrimination in the U.S. was something that really affected her?
It enraged her. They lived in Baltimore from 1948 to 1958, and she would tell us about racist incidents. And she was a social worker and had colleagues of color, and it enraged her that they were being discriminated against. She didn't understand how that could happen in the U.S.
She would invite those colleagues, Black colleagues, to our house. And our neighbors in Baltimore did not see the world the way our mother did, and they were terribly upset and criticized her. And what are you doing inviting those people to your home? And she did it anyway because it was so important to her.
Yeah.
Any others with questions that you want to ask? No? All right.
Yeah, I mean, the Stolper times, I think in our group, we did say that, it evokes that never again idea, in people that you cannot escape, working over these things here and not think to yourself, how did this happen? It cannot happen again. And then it came to race in America as a Black person or an African. I think we marginalize, slavery in American history to dates, to holidays, and to states' rights, just so we don't deal with it here. And I think we don't have the courage. And this is where I always go back to the curriculum as a culprit in everything that is happening here. The kids really have to know the truth, and it has to come through how we teach stuff here and stop marginalizing slavery for the African. Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, I know we've gone over time, but it's been just wonderful to have all of you here. Thank you so much for coming. I want to thank all of you for the work that you do in classrooms, bringing this type of material to students. I know what a challenge it is during this pandemic, even to be a teacher. And I, thank you for the effort that you've made, which I'm sure was difficult, to find the time to watch this film, to look at the curriculum guide, to come here for this workshop today. And I hope that it will give you some things that you can bring, in your own teaching when you go back into the classroom, when you do teaching about the Holocaust. So I will send all of you a follow-up email, but let's see, I realize I forgot to put it in the chat. You can give me 1 minute. We have a quick survey that I will give you. I'll put it in the chat here. You just want to click on the survey that's in the chat. We would love to get your feedback on how it went. Obviously, we were not in the breakout rooms, but this is new for all of us, trying to learn how to do these sorts of workshops in an online environment on Zoom. So we'd love your feedback on what went well, any suggestions for what we could do better in the future. We would really appreciate it. It's a very short 2-question survey. Also, I just want to say that, we would love to see you at Mass Humanities events. We have started doing more online events, thinking of the point that you brought up, Carolyn, about the exchange you had with the young person in Texas. We have started a collaboration with the Mississippi Humanities Council. It's going to be a series of 6 online events where we're really going to be encouraging conversations between residents from Massachusetts and residents from Mississippi, and trying to learn about each other's states. Our first event is on December 3rd, and I will send you in the follow-up email some links to that. We're also starting this Thursday a 3-series program called Let's Talk About Our Democracy. The first event this coming Thursday will be looking at how do we understand the current if you want to say threats to our democracy in a broader historical context, looking at the sort of other moments in our history when our democracy has seemed to be in peril, and what can we learn from those moments? What are the sort of common threads? So those are some things coming up. I will let you all go, and just again, thank you for coming, and I hope you all have a good evening. Susan, question?
There is no survey in the chat.
Ah, let's see. Okay, I thought I had cut it and pasted it, but let me try that again. There we go.
Perfect.
Everybody see it now? Okay, great. So I'll give you a minute to, I'll be able to cut and paste that, or just click on it. And thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.